manner. So I think that there's a reason there. Anyway, also be aware, if you see the dynamics of the infection in Italy, I mean, be careful because the second peak is coming. Anyway.
Now take the third exit from the roundabout.
They could have a second peak later on. Also, for maybe that's a thing that we should talk about maybe in 3 months' time. But I agree that probably is because we were too fast in order to get out of the lockdown.
Okay, so with the number of cases increasing, how concerned are you about that in the context of how many people...
Please take the third exit from the roundabout in half a mile.
Pressure on Spanish hospitals as we saw in the first wave.
Okay, I think that now we are facing two different scenarios. One is the one that my colleague Manuel was explaining in Madrid, where there's really a high rate of hospitalization related to COVID. Instead, what I see in different areas in our area, for instance in Catalonia right now, hospitals are quite okay. We are basically in a much different
Please take the third exit from the roundabout in 300 yards onto A327.
Occupation and in hospitalized patients. Instead, now the pressure is in.
Now take the third exit from the roundabout.
We have there milder cases. Probably all these safety measures based on masks and distancing are doing some effect. So probably I want to be optimistic on that way, and there's something that has been done properly. The hospitals are not receiving the same pressure we had in March and April. That's a clear-cut difference. Outside Madrid, if you want also to tell you my concern right now is that please the authorities in Madrid try to be strict on a lockdown for the whole region. We know that one big problem in the previous wave that the lockdown of Madrid wasn't done at the very first moment, and we are talking about many people there, and they were like really going out, to the coast and whatever, and spreading the disease. So I hope that
please take the third exit from the roundabout in 200 yards onto A325. Now take the third exit from the roundabout.
At the Josep Trueta University. Thanks for joining us. Let's move to the United Kingdom. Here, specific decisions on health are devolved to the four nations, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland and England. Overall in the country, the coronavirus situation is getting worse. Today, the UK government's chief scientific advisor, Sir Patrick Vallance, and Professor Chris Whitty, the UK government's chief medical advisor, have been giving a snapshot of the situation.
We're now going into the seasons, late autumn and winter, which benefit respiratory viruses.
Please turn left in 300 yards onto B3403. Then take the second exit from the roundabout.
We have to deal with collectively. It's not indefinite, and science will in due course ride to our rescue. But in this period of the next 6 months, I think we have to realise that we have to take this collectively very seriously.
Professor Chris Whitty speaking just a few hours ago. We're joined now by Linda Bold, Professor of Public Health at Edinburgh University. Welcome to the programme. At the briefing
now turn left.
Professor Whitty and Patrick Vallance, it was said that there could be 50,000 COVID-19 cases a day in the UK by mid-October. Are you surprised by how serious the situation is?
Now take the second exit from the roundabout.
I guess I'm not surprised because we've been following this so closely, all of us working in public health. I mean, what I would say about the briefing at Westminster level today is that is obviously extrapolation or modelling if things continue at the current rate of replication. We know from a number of other countries that it's not always a clear gradient, it's not always a straight path, so these big numbers, I don't think...
Please take the third exit from the roundabout in 300 yards onto B3403.
Infection survey, which is the one most of us use the most because it's a random sample.
This is the Office of National Statistics.
Yes, sorry, yes, the Office of National Statistics. So what they do is obviously
Now
go and
take the third exit from the roundabout.
home, so it's not reliant on people requesting testing, so it's a more accurate picture. And about a week ago, just over a week ago, the number of infections per day that they estimated in England was just under 4,000, and now for last week in the last bulletin had gone up to 6,000. And then you also see in the people who are actually getting a test, that is reflected in terms of the rise. So we're absolutely moving in the wrong direction. We're not where Spain, as we were just hearing from, is now, but we are going there, and we don't want to see the increase in hospitalizations and deaths that France and Spain are now starting to see.
So these two senior medical advisors also said it would take 6 months to get on top of the virus. Given that we are going
Please
to
take the second exit from the roundabout in 300 yards onto A3A11.
Can't see changes quickly. It goes in trends or waves, and I think that we've always known that the winter would be a crucial period. So measures that are taken now, I would anticipate that we will start to see an effect in sort of 2, 3, 4 weeks, and then we can map the trajectory from there. But
Now take the second exit from the roundabout.
on best estimates much before the end of the year, if that. So we need to be applying the public health measures for the next few months to try and contain it.
And what do you think broadly those should be? What further restrictions need to be put in place? Should there be restrictions on international travel, for instance, a national lockdown, or more localised?
So I think what's going to happen is the Chief Medical Officer laid out 4 areas. The first one was just continuing to follow the guidance around, hand hygiene, face coverings, which are going to be key now that the Centre for Disease Control in the US has made it clear that this is an airborne virus, and physical distancing. But the second one was more about isolating the virus, and that means we're going to have to restrict our social contacts.
Please take the third exit from the roundabout in half a mile.
Being able to visit households, more advice about not visiting older family members, for example, very unfortunately. And then I imagine we're also going to see some closures or curfews on hospitality. So these are the kinds of new measures I anticipate, a bit like what is happening in parts of Europe.
Linda Bolt, Professor of Public Health at Edinburgh University. Thanks for joining us live here on NewsHour. Do tell us what you think about what you hear on our programme. At BBC World Service is the network's Twitter handle. At Razia Iqbal is mine if you want to speak to me directly. Stay with us.
Please take the third exit from the roundabout in 300 yards onto A3A11.
2 years inside the Paris police force.
In the police station where I worked, 4, 5, maybe 6 months.
Now take the third exit from the roundabout.
The majority suffer from this racist and violent minority, but there are no traitors in the police clan. If you denounce someone, you become a traitor, and you risk being sidelined, intimidated and bullied. No one takes that risk.
That interview is coming up in full in half an hour. First, BBC News headlines this hour. Global share markets have fallen sharply amid fears that a renewed rise in coronavirus cases will blight economic prospects. Britain's chief scientific advisor has warned that there could be 50,000
Please take the first exit from the roundabout in 300 yards onto A331.
And the Belarusian opposition leader...
Now take the first exit from the roundabout.
Tough with her country's officials. This is Razia Iqbal with NewsHour live from the BBC in London. Leaked documents have revealed how UK banks have allegedly helped criminals, money launderers and Russians.
Please follow the road for 3.4 miles.
Major banks have failed to stop crime when they suspect it. They show that London is a hub for money laundering, with billions of dollars of suspected dirty money moving through the financial system. The documents, known as the FinCEN files, were leaked to BuzzFeed News and shared with the BBC by the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists. The BBC's Richard Bilton joins me in the NewsHour studio. Richard, welcome. Tell us how significant this leak is first.
Well, I mean, it's unprecedented because for the first time we can see more than 2,000 of these secret files, and they show how banks have been dealing with crime and suspect behaviour. The leak is of suspicious activity reports, they're called SARs, and they're what banks send to the authorities if they think their clients may be up to no good. Now, what's shocking is how often they do nothing. These files have to be sent, but there are millions of them, so they often go unchecked. So meanwhile, the banks, having raised suspicions, sometimes allow criminals and money launderers to just sort of carry on.
And what banks are we talking about? Which ones are in the leak?
Well, there are lots of the high street banks that we're familiar with very much here in the UK. So, for example, the files show that HSBC allowed fraudsters to move $30 million around the world after being told by US investigators that it was a scam. And a sanctioned Russian individual who's close to President Putin was able to use Barclays Bank in London to buy fine art. Now, neither bank would comment on these cases, but HSBC said it had overhauled its ability to combat financial crimes. Barclays said a US Senate report had highlighted their significant cooperation with relevant authorities. But this is big names.
Really big names. And in the investigations and in the leaked data, what do we learn about the banking system and how it functions?
Well, the cases consistently show banks sort of getting it wrong, flagging up suspicions but not stopping dodgy deals. Now, in fairness, some have defended the banks. Sharon Cohen-Levin is a lawyer from the US, and she says the system of suspicious activity reports, these SARS, it's crucial.
I was a former prosecutor, and as a former prosecutor, when I would be working on an investigation, I would always gather any suspicious activity reports. So they really are, in a large part, the lifeblood of US law enforcement.
That said, this leak shows
Please take the first exit from the roundabout in half a mile.
particularly the UK's financial system is just failing to stop dirty money.
Richard Bilton, thanks for joining us. Lots on this story on our website, bbc.com, and a special panorama programme on here in the United Kingdom.
Please take the first exit from the roundabout in 300 yards onto A31.
Because I've been speaking to Greta Bell. She is the
Now take the first exit from the roundabout.
It's a not-for-profit Swiss foundation working to prevent and combat corruption.
My first reaction was, this is great, more of the truth is coming out. In that sense, I think people in my community aren't surprised, but we would have liked to be surprised. My second reaction was actually a little bit of a disappointment about the way the reporting has been going on these leaks. Most
Please follow the road for 5 miles.
things, that they do wrong. But what's so far largely missing, in my view, is a discussion of whether the regulatory and supervisory framework is sufficient. And I think bashing only the banks is kind of distracting from 50% of the truth.
Okay, well, I'll ask you about the other 50% of the truth in a moment. I mean, what do you make of banks saying that the information provided in these investigations is historical? HSBC in particular, saying that they have embarked on a multi-year journey to overhaul their ability to combat financial crime, and Standard Chartered saying that they take their responsibilities to fight financial crime very seriously.
I agree, they've invested huge amounts of resources. I'm not always sure that the systems that are in place are the right ones.
The data that has come out is about these things called SARS, Suspicious Activity Reports. How are they processed, and how do they get to a body, a financial intelligence unit, or in the case of the United States, it is the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network?
Banks are obliged by law to conduct transaction monitoring, customer due diligence, etc., and to report anything that is suspicious to their FIU. In some countries this is thankfully done electronically, but even in developed countries this is actually sometimes done by paper, so here we already have a challenge. FIUs then have to analyze the reports they receive and get back to the bank if they deem it suspicious. And if an FIU then deems a transaction truly suspicious, it would pass, collate a dossier and hand it over to investigating authorities in their respective jurisdiction. The challenge is that while the SARS is being analyzed by the FIU, depending on the country, in most jurisdictions nowadays, banks are actually even obliged to continue transacting despite the fact that they filed a report. But the problem is there's a tension between the risk of tipping a suspect off if you stop a transaction because you think it's suspicious, and the risk of losing the assets if you continue to transaction despite the fact that it looks suspicious. And that's a tension which has been the subject of decades of conversation between FIUs and banks, and I think none of the systems is quite where it should be or works.
So if the system, in the way in which you outline it, was tightened up so that the banks reporting to FIUs is faster, quicker, more efficient, is that one way that you think the response could be faster too, given that tension that you outline?
So I don't think it's a question of banks not reporting fast enough. It's the fact that there is increasing pressure on them to report a lot, which then results in FIUs not actually having the capacity to analyze all these reports fast enough. So I think one of the solutions going forward is that we have to be bold enough to say we need to move away to a degree from analyzing every report to so-called strategic analysis, where you look at generic trends, where you analyze these reports for identifying trends, for identifying new red flags, to actually fine-tune your risk-based approach in banks as well. You have to admit that sometimes you will miss a transaction, but you have to start looking at the right things.
What single thing would you say in the face of all of this data that has emerged should happen next and pretty quickly?
Oh, they need to sit at a table. Financial institutions and public institutions, they really need to find a way to make this process meaningful again. It leads to frustration on both sides. Banks go and say, we're reporting all these things, we never hear back from you, and then we don't know what to do. And you keep bashing us in the media, and then the public sector will say, well, we can't cope with all this data, not under this time pressure. So they really need to sit together and find a way to make the system more intelligent if you want. And at the risk of sometimes missing something, find a system that allows, to capture the big problems.
Is there also an issue that there are always going to be jurisdictions outside whatever conventional setup there is where people can process money anonymously and override whatever systems are in place?
Yes, that's a huge problem. So, which is why if you have to let the money
keep to the left in half a mile.
Or not, you risk that the money then goes to one of those jurisdictions where there's no way we ever get our hands on it anymore.
That was Greta Fenner. She's the Managing Director of the Basel Institute on Governance. You're listening to the BBC World Service. This is NewsHour.
Please keep to the left in 300 yards on A3.
And in a series of special programs, Business Matters is looking at the US election.
Now keep to the left.
Typical voter is, because people who love the president love him, and the people who don't just don't.
In November, America will decide whether to give Republican President Donald Trump another 4 years in the White House.
Keep America great! Or a first term to his Democratic Party opponent, Joe Biden. We have to build back better.
As the election campaigning heats up, we're taking Business Matters to the US.
To gauge the mood in some key states, battleground states, where the election could be won or lost.
Ohio,
Texas,
Pennsylvania,
and Florida.
This is the most important election in the history of our country.
Please follow the road for 10 miles.
Business Matters, US election specials, Tuesday to Saturday at midnight GMT.
Coming up on NewsHour in the next 30 minutes, Belarusian opposition leader Svetlana Tikhanovskaya is in Brussels hoping to get help from the EU. We speak to the US Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg's granddaughter, Clara Spera, a lawyer herself, and the culture of silence among French policemen. We hear from a journalist who went undercover in the Paris police. First, the latest world news.
BBC News with Eileen McHugh. European stock markets have fallen sharply due to growing concerns about the impact of the coronavirus as many countries fail to contain a sharp rise in infections. Share prices in London, Paris and Frankfurt all dropped by more than 3% in morning trading. The British government's chief scientific advisor has warned that the country could see 50,000 new coronavirus cases a day by the middle of next month if no action is taken to halt the current rise. The warning comes as the government prepares to announce new measures aimed at restricting the pandemic's spread. Elsewhere in Europe, tough new restrictions have been introduced in the Spanish capital, Madrid. The top opposition leader in Belarus, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, has appealed to the European Union foreign ministers in Brussels to be brave and implement planned sanctions against senior officials in her country. Ms. Tikhanovskaya met the foreign ministers as part of efforts to maintain international pressure on Belarus's long-term leader, Alexander Lukashenko. President Trump says he will name a new Supreme Court judge later this week, on Friday or Saturday, following the death of the liberal Ruth Bader Ginsburg. His rival in November's election, Joe Biden, has urged senators to delay the confirmation vote. The Electoral Commission in Myanmar has refused to delay November's national election despite a rise in coronavirus cases, but it says measures would be taken to avoid overcrowding at polling stations. The authorities in Afghanistan say about 30 security personnel have been killed in attacks by the Taliban. The attacks took place in 4 different provinces. And officials in Botswana say the mysterious deaths of large numbers of elephants in the country were caused by a toxic bacteria which occurs naturally in standing water. They say 330 elephants are now known to have died. That's the latest BBC News.
Welcome back to NewsHour. More on the political fallout from the death of the US Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg shortly. First, though, the exiled Belarusian opposition leader Svetlana Tikhanovskaya is in Brussels today to discuss sanctions against President Alexander Lukashenko following August's disputed election and the subsequent 5 weeks of protests in Belarus. President Lukashenko claims he won 80% of the vote, with Ms. Tikhanovskaya receiving less than 10%. Let's go to Brussels and speak to the BBC's Gavin Lee. Gavin, let's start with getting you to tell us who she's been meeting there.
Yeah, she's been having a sit-down breakfast with all of the European Union's foreign ministers, and some of them individually, including the Irish Simon Coveney, the foreign minister there. It's interesting actually because she's been in Lithuania for the past more than a month now in sort of self-imposed exile, fearing for her safety, and she was pretty loud. She gave a brief press conference after the breakfast meeting in which she said ministers have to act quickly. They have to be more brave than they're being now, because there's simply too much time going by and continuing brutal repression against the Belarusian people. Now, she's saying this because what's happening at the moment is 3 weeks ago that EU diplomats started to work out a sanctions list, which now includes about 40 officials of the security units or the government within Belarus, people that the EU accuse of either being involved in the alleged vote rigging during elections in August or for brutally cracking down on protesters. Now, Cyprus is holding the whole thing up because it has to involve unanimity, and it has to be approval from all member states. But Cyprus says they will only vote on this if they get their issue looked at as well, which is to take action against Turkey, which is accused of illegal drilling for gas in Greece and Cypriot territorial waters. So that's the issue. We're waiting actually very shortly, in the next 10 minutes or so, there should be an update from a result of that meeting. So we'll get a sense as has it moved any way forward since Svetlana Tikhanovskaya spoke this morning.
Okay, and what about another EU country, Poland, calling for financial support for the civil society in Belarus to rival Russia's offer of $1.5 billion?
It's interesting, and it's being looked at. Josep Borrell, the Foreign Affairs Chief for the EU, has said this morning that this is one of the things that they will discuss today. They'll look at this list of 40, and also fascinating, actually, change of language from the Germans. In brief, we heard from Heiko Maas, the Foreign Minister, saying that it's time now that Alexander Lukashenko himself, the president, should be included in these sanctions. He's not at the moment. And from sources I've been speaking to within the EU, they believe that Josep Borrell, the Foreign Affairs Chief, is also keen to have him added to this list. So let's see in the next few minutes whether that happens or not.
Gavin Lee, the BBC's Gavin Lee, joining us live from Brussels. Needless to say, lots and lots on the background to what's been happening in Belarus on our website, bbc.com/news. Now to the political fallout in the United States. The atmosphere has been both feverish and febrile since the death on Friday, September the 18th, of the Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. She was 87. Speaking at a vigil for Ms. Ginsburg, the Democratic Senator for Massachusetts, Elizabeth Warren, said her party would do everything it could to stop a new Supreme Court Justice being appointed before the election in November.
Our very democracy is on the line. 4 years ago, Mitch McConnell told us that there would be no vote in the United States Senate on a Supreme Court nominee because our president had only 1 year in office. And every Republican stood with him in the United States Senate. Today, Mitch McConnell and his henchmen believe that they can ram through a Supreme Court justice only 45 days from the election. Mitch McConnell believes that this fight is over. What Mitch McConnell does not understand is this fight has just begun.
Elizabeth Warren, well, President Trump has said he will press ahead with plans to nominate a new Supreme Court Justice and will name his choice on either Friday or Saturday of this week. Let's hear now from our Washington correspondent Gary O'Donoghue. I asked him what else the president had been saying about the nomination.
President Trump's already said, of course, that he plans to nominate a woman for the spare place on the Supreme Court, and there are a couple of names that are already being bandied around, one of whom has already been vetted for the previous vacancy, so that could mean things move very, very fast on a nomination. So we are expecting that to happen. Whether or not he plans to push ahead with a vote before the election is still open to question, because there are so many variables in that particular calculation, not least how many more Republicans might potentially come out against the idea of pressing forward with the process before November 3rd election.
Okay, I suppose we should explain then that 2 Republican senators already have come out and said that they support allowing Joe Biden to name the next justice if he were to win in November. Just tell us, give us some background to these 2 women who have said that.
Well, these are 2 senators, Susan Collins from Maine, who's in a very, very tight re-election race up there, and Lisa Murkowski from Alaska, who is not so much in that kind of position, but is someone who is perhaps on the more moderate wing of the Republican Party. They've said that they don't support pressing forward with a nomination. They haven't actually said they'd vote against a Trump nominee, so that is some wiggle room there. Everyone is now looking towards senators like Mitt Romney from Utah. Remember, Donald Trump before 2016, now a member of the Senate, voted against the president, the only Republican to vote against the president on one of the articles of impeachment. Everyone's waiting to see what he will do, and the maths of this are very have a 53-47 majority. If they lose 3 Republican votes, then the vice president gets to break a 50-50 vote. If they lose more than 3, then they're into very difficult territory. Add to all that, Razia, the complication of what we call the lame duck period here, which is after the election. The Senate actually carries on sitting in its current form, and it's not impossible that Republicans could lose the Senate and still press ahead with a nomination vote after the November 3rd election.
Gary O'Donoghue in Washington. I've also been speaking with Bader Ginsburg. She was with her grandmother till the very end. I began by asking her about those final weeks and days.
In the final days of her life, my grandmother and I spoke a lot about a lot of things, and I asked her if there was anything she wanted to say to the public, to anyone that wasn't already out there, and she said there was, and I pulled out my computer and she dictated the following sentence to me. She said, my most fervent wish is that I will not be replaced until a new president is installed. And I read it back to her. She was very happy with that. And when I asked her, is that it? Is there anything else you'd like to say? She said, the rest of my work is a matter of public record. So that was all she wanted to add.
And also, what is a matter of public record is that during President Trump's time in office, he has appointed 2 Supreme Court justices. And I wonder whether during the course of her last few days, weeks, months, whether she discussed with you having any regret that she didn't step down so that President Obama could appoint a Supreme Court justice.
She never expressed that regret to me. My grandmother fundamentally was someone who believed in the institutions that she served and the fundamental institutions of American governance, you know, the Senate, the House, the presidency. And for her, keeping politics out of the Supreme Court was a very important thing. You recall that she was confirmed by the Senate 96-3, and one of her biggest boosters at the time was a very Republican Senator, Orrin Hatch. And she never imagined, until it was far too late, that the Supreme Court nomination and confirmation process would have become as fraught as it had under President Trump. And I don't think she had regret because she didn't step down, I believe, in part because of her faith in these institutions.
As a lawyer who is a woman, I wonder how much she was somebody who was a lodestar for you, because in your studying as a lawyer, I'm sure you came across other people who were mentors to you, but while you were studying, to what extent was she the person that you turned to again and again?
She was the person I turned to again and again long before I ever went to law school, because before being a role model or, you know, a legal star, she was my grandmother. And in the same way, I may have turned to her in law school with questions or asking for advice. I had always done that because of who she was to me. That said, it was only really when I got to law school that I recognized the real impact of the work that she had done, because in law school, no matter what law school one attends in the United States, you will read her opinions, you will read her dissents, and you will likely read cases, the opinions that resulted from cases she brought as a young advocate to the Supreme Court in the 1970s. And so I gained a new appreciation for her, indeed, as a lawyer when I was in law school. And so I will admit, if I ever had questions about constitutional law and specifically gender in the law, I was incredibly privileged that she was just an email away.
And I just wondered to what extent in that context you had disagreements with her over issues.
I don't know that she and I had real disagreements, but I do think that and she welcomed this, represent and have developed a sort of new generational thinking. She and her colleagues and those who came before her, and that's so important to remember because she was someone who always noted that she was not the first to argue the things that she argued. She was building on foundations that were built by women like Dorothy Kenyon and Polly Murray before her. And in that same way, my generation and hopefully the one after are building upon the legacy that she left. And so if our views differ, it's because I have the ability to go further, to think beyond the foundation that she laid and some of the arguments that she was constricted to because of the time that she was arguing them.
And when she underlined again and again the importance of the strength of institutions and her belief in not just institutions such as the Supreme Court, but the Constitution of the United States, how did she reflect with you as somebody who was not just the next generation, but the generation after that, about the way in which those institutions have, for many people, not all, but for many people, been undermined in the last 4 years or so?
I can't obviously speak for her, but I do believe that she thought that this current moment was an aberration and that the institutions in which she believed would recover and would continue to expand to include those that have been left out.
And I wonder also, given how she recognised the shift to a much more partisan process in the run-up to appointing another justice had become over her own lifetime on the court, I wonder how you now reflect on her passing becoming this kind of moment in American political life in an election year. I mean, she must have known that there would be a huge outcry one way or the other, and she would not have written that note to you or dictated that note to you if she wasn't aware of it. How do you reflect on the moment that your country finds itself in?
Well, I would say a few things. The first is, I think your question hits the point exactly, in that she was concerned about this country and about the court that she served so diligently for over 27 years. And so when she dictated that statement to me, it was about the court. It was about the court's legitimacy, the court as an institution, and not about her as a person, as a jurist, as a lawyer. And I think that speaks to what she would think about this moment. And I think she would be heartened to know that there are many, many people who believe that we need to return to order and norms and agree and want to help fulfill that most fervent wish of hers. And as for me, it is incredibly overwhelming in many ways just to see this outpouring of support, admiration, gratitude, and respect. But it's also very comforting in my own grief, because I know that those things are not zero sum, and that it was a real privilege, and continues to be a privilege, to get to share her with so many people that admire her the way that I do.
That was Clara Sperrer, a lawyer and fellow at the American Civil Liberties Union and the granddaughter of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. We, of course, extend our condolences to her and her family. And as you can imagine, given the stature of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, an awful lot on our website about her, a full obituary, and perhaps also you'll be able to find a long interview that I did with Ruth Bader Ginsburg in December 2019. bbc.com/news.
Now let's look at what else you can hear from the BBC World Service. In 10 minutes, the documentary, Hey Sisters, So Sisters.
This is artist and astronaut Nicole Stott. When I flew to the International Space Station, a group of unsung heroes helped make my mission happen. NASA employed a group of seamstresses whose sewing helped protect the spaceship.
At 15 GMT, you can hear Hard Talk with Zainab Badawi.
My guest is Democratic politician Katie Hill. She claims she was forced to resign as a congresswoman because of double standards.
Then the conversation is between two women fighting abuse under lockdown.
Two women working to support domestic abuse victims in the UK and the US discuss why lockdown led to a surge in cases and how they've had to quickly adapt to cope with the increased demands from victims, who are mainly women and children.
That's all still to come here on the BBC World Service. Now back to Razia Iqbal and NewsHour.
And a reminder of our top story this hour. Britain's chief scientific advisor has warned that there could be 50,000 daily new cases of the coronavirus by mid-October if further restrictions aren't introduced. Speaking to NewsHour, Professor of Public Health Linda Bold urged caution regarding those.
Please turn left in half a mile.
Level today is that is obviously extrapolation or modelling if things continue at the current rate of replication. We know from a number of other countries that it's not always a clear gradient, it's not always a straight path, so these big numbers, I don't think, we should necessarily assume that they would occur.
That's our top story. Global share markets have fallen sharply amid fears.
Please turn left in 300 yards onto South Lane.
Mysterious deaths of large numbers of elephants in Botswana has been found to be...
Now turn left.
This is Razia Iqbal with NewsHour live from the BBC in London. Now, the richest 1% of people around the world cause more than double the carbon emissions of the 3 billion who make up the poorest 50%. That's the finding of a report by the charity Oxfam, and I've been speaking to its head of policy, advocacy and research. His name is Tim Gore. First, on how they worked out this conclusion.
We take an approach to calculate what are called consumption emissions. So this attributes all of the carbon emissions in the world.
Please turn right in half a mile, then turn left.
Produced where those are consumed. So if a car is built in China but it's exported to Germany, then all of the emissions that are produced to make that car get allocated to Germany. So we take then those consumption emissions totals for all the countries in the period from 1990 to 2015, and we allocate those to individuals within each country based on a relationship between emissions and income, because we know from lots of studies that as people's income increases, so do their emissions footprints. So that's how we calculate the distribution of emissions amongst all these countries, and then we put it all together as though everybody in the world lived in just one country, so that we can divide it between the global rich and the global poor.
And the richest 1% are people who earn how much?
You had to earn just over $100,000 net income per year to get into that group. So this is it's a minority of the world population.
Please turn right in 300 yards onto South Lane West, then turn left.
6 million people around the world are responsible for more than twice as much carbon dioxide emissions as the poorest half of the world, and we're talking about a 25-year period.
That's right.
What is it that's surprising about this? Because for a lot of people that wouldn't be particularly surprising, that if you are more wealthy, you are much more likely to consume more.
It's not just a sort of a moral outrage. The urgency is such that we're going to use we can only put a certain amount of carbon
Now turn right.
We want to keep warming below, for example, the 1.5 degree target that was enshrined in the Paris Agreement, to which all our governments signed up just a few years ago. We can only put a certain amount of carbon into the atmosphere if we want to keep below that.
Now turn left.
10% used up about a third of that in just those 25 years. And what is left is going to be completely used up on current rates by 2030.
Are those emissions from rich people mainly coming from flying and buying big gas-guzzling cars?
A lot of it is. Look, there's lots of studies that have tried to understand and break down where these very high carbon footprints come from, and most of them agree that the biggest share of the highest footprints comes from transport. Say the richest emitters in the EU, for example, around half their emissions come from transport. And for the very highest emitters, an even bigger share comes from aviation in particular. So we can do a lot. We can make a big start in tackling this extreme carbon inequality by addressing transport. It's the most unequal high carbon sector. It's a difficult one to tackle, but not impossible. We can have governments that invest in electric vehicles, public transport, cycling in cities and so on, so that people have low carbon alternatives, which just happen to be much better.
Now turn right.
And that will help to drive down emissions. So it's not impossible to do, but we need governments to grasp the nettle and get serious about it, starting now.
Tim Gore, who is
now turn right
and research at the charity Oxfam. The French police, hailed as heroes after the terrorist attacks of 2015, are now facing growing criticism in the wake of the Gilets jaunes protests and the Black Lives Matter movement. Police representatives say that worsening public hostility and working conditions are fueling an epidemic of psychological problems and suicides. One journalist spent 2 years on
You have reached your destination. Your destination is on the right.
He spoke about his experiences to our Paris correspondent, Lucy Williamson.
In the police, there's an omerta. There are no traitors in the police.
Valentin Gendreau has spent 2 years undercover as a policeman in the 19th district of Paris.
In the police station where I worked, 4, 5, maybe 6 policemen, so 32.